Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming here and being with us today. This is the last event of our 30th year of celebration of gender studies. My name is Emrah Karakuş, and I'm an LSE Fellow in Gender and Human Rights in the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. This evening, we are excited to have three wonderful scholars whose work is powerfully and radically intervening in and shaping our understanding of sexualities, identities, and rights. Their insights are especially crucial at a time when so-called gender-critical feminism and right-wing populist movements dominate global agendas, emerging from and intertwined with colonial, neoliberal, and biopolitical regimes of valuation. We know that such regimes of valuation still continue to register millions of people as undeserving or less than human, pushing them to the violent margins of the margins under the devastating effects of capitalism and permanent war. Hence, it's ever more important today to reflect on how sexualities, identities, and human rights have become the frontiers where our most intimate ways of relating to ourselves and others may be weaponized against ourselves, our communities, and our struggles for freedom. Before introducing our panelists, I would like to take this opportunity to salute the struggles of Palestinian people in and beyond Gaza against ongoing genocide, which has now caused the lives of over 25,000 people and massive infrastructural destruction in Gaza. Let us never stay silent, and let's continue organizing against this imperial regime of silencing, surveillance, and mass murder. This evening, we will listen to the distinguished scholar, Professor Sylvia Tamale. She's a leading African feminist and scholar. She recently retired from Makerere University's School of Law, where she was the first female dean of law in the country. Professor Tamale has inspired many scholars and activists globally with numerous publications, including her recent award-winning book, Decolonization and Afrofeminisms, as well as her work in several academic institutions and international human rights boards. Professor Tamale holds a PhD in sociology and feminist studies from the University of Minnesota, and she was recently awarded an honorary doctorate of law by the University of Pretoria, South Africa. Our panel invites our brilliant SM Rodriguez, who is an assistant professor of gender rights and human rights in the LSE Gender Studies. Their pathbreaking work spans concerns of criminalized, queer, and disabled people of African descent, interrogating global and transnational structures of racialization, punishment, and movement making. They are the author of the Economies of Queer Inclusion, Transnational Organizing for LGBT Rights in Uganda, and numerous publications for Agenda, GLQ, Comparative Sociology, and Oxford University Press. Finally, our panel welcomes the wonderful, brilliant scholar Sharmila Parmanand, who is an assistant professor in gender development and globalization here at LSE Gender Studies. Her research examines the colonial histories and gendered logic that underpin development and humanitarian interventions in the global South. Her forthcoming book, Saving Our Sisters, The Politics of Anti-Trafficking and Sex Work in the Philippines, shows how anti-trafficking involves the language of development and human rights to entrench border control practices and gender policing of precarious workers. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our wonderful panelists.
Sure. Okay. Thank you all so much for attending. I'm so pleased and so excited to be in the space. So thank you so much to everyone been sitting here with me, because the opportunity to share this panel with my esteemed colleague, Sharmila, and then, of course, with Professor Tamale, whose work I have followed very closely for nearly 15 years, and from whose perspective I source so much inspiration. I will say I remember being outside of your office in Kampala 10 or 11 years ago, really hoping to meet you, and you were either on sabbatical or summer holiday, but I was like, okay, but I'm here, and I'm gonna record this moment. And so just being able to sit next to you feels like a long-awaited and cherishable moment. I'll start with that, and I won't get emotional. So, to introduce the talk that I will offer today, I began a project in 2017 called Abolition in the Academy, focusing on abolitionist academics globally to understand their impact on street protests, and historical, philosophical, scholarly, and grassroots sources of their political and research commitments. I'm excited to pursue this as a book now. It has changed shape remarkably, because it's funny what, 7 years of thinking, just thinking, hardly writing, plus a global pandemic will do. But now, tentatively called Abolitionist Archipelagos, which focuses on the geographically and temporally disparate and yet connected praxis of penal abolitionist movement making today, globally, specifically looking at the African diaspora. This talk is excerpted from African Feminisms for Abolitionist Future, so I really appreciated that question earlier, because I thought, wow, what a segue. Archival hauntings and a speculative geography. And it puts forward an understanding of the colonial carceral diaspora and African political womanhood while using Black feminist ontology. The fuller work considers abolitionist praxis, especially healing and transformative justice, while I develop a conceptual tool that I call sexual corrections, understanding the corrective violence of regulating gender and my screen just shut off, gender through sexualized techniques of surveillance, punishment, and discipline. So I'll just jump into this excerpt, and I'm looking forward to kind of any questions, because I realize that there will be gaps. So perhaps when La Mulâtresse Solitude decides to fight, she holds her ballooning belly and hums a song of liberty to her unborn child. Guadeloupe has known freedom from enslavement for 8 years due to the law of 4th of February, 1794, and yet Napoleon has decided to reinstate African enslavement to the benefit of French planters. Solitude, however, is known to be a maroon. While she was born into slavery, she lives her teens and adult years as a fugitive in a settlement away from the island's sugar and coffee plantations. But Napoleon's nearing navy carries the promise of chattel slavery for those racialized as Black, threatening all but the planters on the island. Solitude's refusal of the return to slavery manifests in a steadfast determination to raise arms. Pregnant, she fights alongside Louis Delcroix, her revolutionary rage sparking legends. Before this insurgency ends, Solitude and the Black rebels bless gunpowder stores, desperate for lasting freedom in life or death. Unlike most others, she survives. She's captured and imprisoned. Solitude becomes immortal at the age of 30, giving birth in prison a day before execution. While the French colonizers imagined Black value only in relation to the imperial economy, saving her son for his extractive value as an enslaved commodity, maroon knowledge leads us to imagine Black lives matter for the very fact of being. It is this epistemology, this fugitive knowledge, that brings us to the time-defying, context-expanding abolitionist imagination. Like the call for abolition, La Mulâtresse has only multiplied. She stands as statues in Guadeloupe and more recently in Paris. The Parisian monument to Solitude was birthed in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter's rallies throughout Europe and the US. To rid itself of the colonial nostalgia erected as statues of enslavers, imperialists, and brutalizers. The toppling of public commemorative displays follows movements such as Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, and globally witnessed events such as the 2018 toppling of a Mahatma Gandhi monument in Accra, Ghana, by university students critical of his historical anti-Black racism. In strong contrast to the public recognition or celebration of European colonial heritage, Solitude's defiant posture in Paris offers young abolitionists the possibility of imagining a lasting resistance to racial capitalism. The international Black Lives Matter movement impacted the rebirth of Solitude's story in Paris in 2022, after years of struggle as a movement that began in 2013, yet relies on the life worlds created by centuries of struggle for African sovereignty, life, and joy. I believe much can be told through Solitude's haunting half-life. The abolitionist spirit revives through movement organizations such as Black Lives Matter, which dedicates its website to imagining abolition. Understood as the project of organizing an alternative social infrastructure capable of ending systems of racialized deprivation and violence. It endeavors to raise consciousness of the possibility of sustaining life amid death worlds, but also to ending the death world rendered by carcerality. By death worlds, I refer to Achille Mbembe's concept that describes the, quote, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of the living dead. They are physical, political, and social formations that subject African people to perpetual loss, injury, and early death. I use it to advance a speculative geography, a way to remap our connections away from the merely physical realities of land masses and oceans. The current penal abolitionist movement is one such struggle against the death world, focusing primarily on prisons, policing, medicalized and psychiatric incarceration, border patrol, and encampment. Many within the movement situate these deadly spaces and practices in a time continuum of enslavement and coloniality. So I ask, how can we recenter the transnational legacy of African women's resistance to carceralism to better understand their contribution to today's abolitionist imagination? Alongside Pfingst and Kamari, I consider carceralism the social mechanism, quote, defining and determining criminality and authorizing spatial, temporal, and material modes of punishment, end quote, which reanimates coloniality through inordinate surveillance, arbitrary detention, and zones of separation. The stories cited in this chapter serve as sites of resistance to colonial punishments, such as involuntary servitude, imprisonment, immigrant detention, displacement, and their political economic underpinnings. In turn, the sites of resistance, I argue, speak to penal abolition, defined not as the movement against oppressive institutions, but that which seeks to end the ideologies that uphold and reanimate them. The emphasis of penal abolitionist movements depends on regional politics, economies, and histories. Throughout Africa and its diaspora, historically, this may mean the abolition of European governments, political remnants, and capital extraction. And recently, as Vivian Salehana attests, can be viewed as an extension of the movement to abolish colonization. In fighting to remove colonial institutions of control, one continues to fight colonialism in Africa. I will say through this, because of time, I'm actually not going to share most of the stories and the case studies that are written, but I can encourage you to read the chapter. So abolitionist feminist Angela Davis argues that gender structures the prison. The very design, function, and logic of prisons are set upon gendered ideologies that emphasize a natural binary, imbue privileged assumptions, and form differentiated punishment for people coded men, women, or otherwise gender deviant. One such assumption embedded within the prison structure is that normal, natural women are less inclined to engage in criminalized behavior. This assumption leads to the pathologization of the few who end up incarcerated, particularly the poor, the queer, the sexual, and the racialized. It also encourages different reformational actions as corrective control. These reformatory practices include homesteading, cooking and cleaning, tending to animals, and laundry and textile services. And just as a bit that you won't because of the limitations of the talk. But one of the works that I'm referencing in here is Stella Niansi's book, No Roses from My Mouth, which is a book of poetry that she wrote while incarcerated. Therefore, the Reformation imagined is a gendered one that reflects its coloniality. The unruly are brought to a site of control for the purpose of extraction under the guise of a civilizing mission. However, we must ground rehabilitation in its necessary precursor of pathologization and understand that punishment and incapacitation continue to coexist with, if not supersede, the reformatory logic. Detained women have been referred to as crazy, unstable, hysterical, or even witches by colonial administration. As such, rehabilitation often looks like forced psychiatrization and medicalizing women's reform. These medicines may create embodied prisons within the imprisoned body. To rehabilitate is to identify a fundamental unwellness, a wrongness in someone, and restore them to the ableist, racist, sexist, ageist, imagined ideal version of themselves. It not only ignores structural conditions that lead to many criminalized acts, but it also displaces blames on survivors of violence for their trauma. Doing time is imagined to correct behaviors, but not the societal cultures that reproduce harm, such as domestic abuse, rape culture, class hierarchization, etc. Notably, in some African indigenous sensibilities, doing time means suffering awayness, an irreparable severing from the sense of a collective self. Furthermore, women's imprisonment is incapacitative on various levels. First, removing purportedly deviant women from society preserves the image and idea of the pure woman, and it isolates surplus women from greater society during their potentially reproductive years. The extra-legal punishments received while incarcerated are well documented, especially the rapes of sexual abuse, which traumatize those who are incarcerated. This carceral trauma is in and of itself disabling, thereby structurally, physically, and psychologically altering the public participation of people of all genders who are considered surplus. As such, anti-carceral feminists argue that societal disablement is a cyclical project. Structural neglect and carcerality exist outside of the prison and then funnel women into the further disabling environment of the prison. They are then ejected, traumatized, back into society, less able to live fulfilling and dignified lives. Therefore, many argue that imprisonment supports the aims of eugenics, removing the racialized, poor, queer, and disabled from the public in the short term and in a progressive eugenicist sense. This argument is only supported by the critical scholarship into the practices of abortion, sterilization, and antenatal neglect in carceral facilities. However, in a more general sense, we must understand that women's imprisonment serves to stop the quote-unquote unruly African from challenging the social order of white supremacy. This social death, or expulsion from humanity, is a facet of necropolitics that we need to recenter to understand the strategic silencing of women of African descent. While this argument is well worn in literature about men as political prisoners, women are often excluded from this perspective in study. Recentering African political womanhood brings us to a different analysis of carceral repression and gender. As Ifya Madiumi informs, Igbo womanhood was initially curious to the colonial eye due to their steadfast political participation and revolt. African womanhood does not and has never meant docility. African women have historically played very crucial political roles in defying imperialism, creating knowledge, public knowledge, and resisting nationalist repression. Reconciling this truth with the facts of women's imprisonment as a reflection of the political project of enforcing a sexed binary brings us to question imprisonment as always political, as always about maintaining a social order that favors coloniality. Islanda Good-Robeson in 1954 wrote, quote, "When I was a little girl, I used to think that only criminals, bad, wicked, evil people, dangerous to the community, were put in jail. Now I'm a woman grown, living in a rapidly changing world. I know that very often very good, very wonderful people are put in jail because they are dangerous. not to the community, but to the few, sometimes very wicked and corrupt people who are in power. I share this work to re-articulate danger through an African abolitionist perspective. If our political sensibilities are a danger to the neo-colonial order, then prisons function not to protect us from danger, but as a management scheme in response to us as politically dangerous beings. Whether this is a politic of the wayward, as writes Saidiya Hartman, or of the imprisoned intellectual or revolutionary, as written or explored by Joy James, or of the gender disruptor, the mission remains. Only connection will serve our collective freedom. So methodologically, I engage connection using what I called a methodology of connection that I conceptualized in the economies of queer inclusion. But also, as I connect three women whose narratives and practices have traveled over time and oceans, La Mulatresse Solitude, Claudia Jones, and Stella Niansi have crafted or inspired resistance literature that reveals women's unique contribution to rebellion against foreign domination and nations' internal struggles against patriarchal domination and class oppression. Simultaneously, the stories of these women elucidate the connections of the colonial carceral diaspora. And so to ideally stand alongside our leading African feminist, Professor Sylvia Tamale, in her work, in her call within her recent book, Decolonization Afrofeminism, the aim here is to bring, to quote, bring to the fore, right, feminist perspectives within the African decolonial effort. Through its commitment to intersectionally addressing structural violence. And so as a project of Black alternative mapping, I imagine the colonial carceral diaspora as a product of the dispersal of technologies of punishment and surveillance applied to African people and the dispersal of African people through such penality, particularly forced migration. And I think, of course, we can all consider what's happening now in the UK with this idea to deport migrants and refugee seekers to Rwanda. I consider this diaspora in relationship to the work of Mekenagel, who argued that the USA has created a new diaspora of prison cages by trafficking African descendants from prison to prison, already historically displaced by slavery. However, this analysis extends beyond the USA and includes African continental participation in imprisonment, which has physical and motivational roots in colonialism. For critical criminologist and Egyptian feminist Vivian Salehana, what involuntarily binds us together are the institutionalized, thus wide-ranging and repetitive praxis of colonial violence. As such, I consider connection, or what binds us, in the senses of both violence and creation. This is the nature of diaspora. So the African diaspora begins as a story of force, migration, labor, and racial identification, but it lives as a story of resistance and connection. While the markers of force have shifted rather than died, the resistance and connection have only amplified. What the stories that I research of Solitude, of Claudia, of Stella offer us is a look at how resistance moves across borders and then inspires new generations of movements. The three are stories of migration, forced migration or exile. Even when meant to be defeated or deported, the revolutionary spirit lives on. It mushrooms in exile. So using Vivian Salehana's words, African women's political struggle does not experience death, but rather it haunts white supremacy. What this haunting gives us is the vision, truth, and possibility of abolition. According to Dylan Rodriguez, abolition is a dream toward futurity, vested in insurgent, counter-civilizational histories, genealogies of collective genius that perform liberation under conditions of duress. For Liat Ben Moshe, abolition requires a disepistemology, a letting go of attachments to clairvoyance and expertise and the hyperspecific and formulaic demands for replacement institutions. Those who have let go, who live renounced, like maroons, hold transformative knowledge. As abolition requires the end of dehumanization, Wando Achebe reminds us of an Igbo saying that, when translated, says, he who will hold another down in the mud must stay in the mud in order to keep him down. She explains that, quote, the revocation of someone's human rights forces an unaliving, unhumaning, unbeing onto them, which forces all, oppressed and oppressor, to lose the beauty of their being. We only reach our full humanity when we uphold and collaboratively sustain the humanness of others. As such, I look at the African indigenous epistemologies that have traveled and propagated possibilities for the humanity of others throughout the diaspora. That's it. I have some notes about this whole human thing, but we can talk about that later. That's all I've got now.
Hi, everyone. Once again, congratulations to LSE Gender Studies for your 30th birthday. When I was invited to speak at this symposium, I accepted, but I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about, and I scratched my head for weeks. And then about 3 weeks ago, boom! The Constitutional Court in Uganda delivered its judgment on the the Anti-Homosexuality Act petition. And in my paper, I'm going to use the acronym, because Anti-Homosexuality Act is a mouthful. I'm going to use the acronym AHA. Because it would be laughable if it wasn't so tragic, its content. But yeah, so when I say AHA, you know I'm talking about the Anti-Homosexuality Act. And that is how I'm structuring my talk. And because there's no time, let me get right into it. It is no secret that Africa is in a huge crisis, which is largely the result of coloniality and neoliberalism. The crisis manifests in bad governance, physical profligacy, inappropriate education, dysfunctional healthcare systems, high unemployment rates, poor infrastructure, and food insecurity. And normally, where there's a crisis, you also find scapegoating. Scapegoat theory postulates the process of blaming and even persecuting an innocent group of people as a proposed solution to a crisis. In Uganda, a crisis of morality was manufactured to camouflage the real crisis afflicting the country. The phantom crisis of child recruitment into homosexuality that has been ongoing for over a decade effectively pushed the panic button and instilled fear in the broader society, resulting in the reenactment of the the AHA, in 2023. Among other things, the law prohibits same-sex relations between consenting adults, imposing a sentence of life imprisonment for its violators. It also introduced capital punishment for any person who commits aggravated homosexuality, which covers repeat offenders and/or those who engage in same-sex relations with a member of a vulnerable group, such as children, people with disabilities, and the elderly. Furthermore, the law imposes rehabilitative therapy for convicted felons and sets serious limitations on the rights of homosexual individuals to lease property or seek employment involving children. This new legislation is doubtlessly a destructive mechanism. The immediate effect of the law was to embolden the perpetuation of structural violence against non-conforming sexual and gender persons, or those perceived to be so. Indeed, cases of violence, evictions, employment terminations, and arrests spiked in the wake of AHA and continue to grow. In the face of the numerous provisions that overrode constitutional protections, 22 individuals petitioned the Constitutional Court challenging the validity of the law. Most importantly, they believed that the law infringed on the autonomy and dignity of a section of Ugandan citizens guaranteed by the Constitution. Moreover, most provisions in the law were duplicating child protections and offenses that already existed on Ugandan law books, including Section 145 of the Penal Code, introduced by the British colonialists, that prohibited sex against the order of nature. On April 3 this year, the Constitutional Court returned with its decision reaffirming the legitimacy of AHA. So this afternoon, I'm going to unpack the dynamics behind the law and surface the influence of coloniality on the AHA. So the reality behind the heteronormative sexual order. Narratives constructed to invoke panic preceded the passing of the first AHA 1, in 2014, and were whipped up again in 2023 to pave the way for the enactment of AHA 2 last year. 2 months prior to the passing of AHA 2, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament reported to the House, and I quote, "Honorable colleagues, I'm getting painful and gruesome stories. Many people are dying in silence, but it seems our schools have been completely penetrated." The pun. It also seems like recruitment centers are very open. It is extremely painful. We are completely not in charge of our children. It is an issue which we must tackle head on, without fear of anyone, because this is all we have. The moment you finish our children, then we no longer have anything, end quote. Pedophilia is a well-established homophobic trope, historically used for justifying the discrimination and derogation of homosexuals worldwide. It is also a key tool of mobilization for politicians and religious figures that need to re-engage a disillusioned and economically oppressed population. Reinforced by religious and cultural fundamentalism, such discourse works to deliberately obstruct the diversity and plurality of sexuality. In Uganda, no tangible evidence of recruitment has ever been tabled, apart from a handful of self-seeking homosexuals who unscrupulously swear affidavits, claiming that they were recruited into the practice. A good example is Elisha Mukisa, a self-identified ex-gay campaigner, who, after recording videos that were pivotal to the enactment of AHA 2, turned around and begged the LGBTIQ community to forgive him for his baseless lies and accept him back into their fold. This was after the power brokers pulled back the perks that they had extended to him prior to the passing of AHA 2. However, beyond scapegoating, we need to explore the material basis behind the construction of normative masculinities and femininities, as well as the denial of sexual queerness. In sum, there are far deeper and more complex structural issues undergirding compulsory heteronormativity. Indeed, it is not the moral social order of Uganda that homosexuality supposedly threatens, but the very sustainability of its socio-economic order. The historical formulation of the idealized family unit, typically comprising a male patriarch head and subordinated wife and children, was basic for the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. In particular, capitalism is implicated in shaping gendered bodies to serve its basic interest of maximization of profits. Hence, homosexuality threatens the traditional image of the family, the bedrock that forms the indispensable foundation of capitalist patriarchal power. Preserving the heteropatriarchal family guarantees the protection of capitalist accumulation of profits from exploiting women's caring domestic labor. It also secures women as a labor reserve and maintains the binary gender hierarchy. Basically, the capitalist economy survives on maintaining slave-like conditions of work for women. Specifically, Their unpaid productive and social reproductive labor generates a healthy labor force which subsidizes capitalist production. In short, employers can afford to pay their workforce less than the means of basic survival thanks to the presence of subordinated women in their lives that absorb and pick up the slack. This compensatory mechanism is seen in women's unpaid household workload, nurturing children, caring for the sick and elderly, as well as subsistence food production. Same-sex families would shake these naturalized ideologies and conditions of hegemonic masculinity and femininity and domesticity to the point of collapse. Law and religion are two powerful tools used by the neoliberal patriarchal state to ensure that does not happen. Let me talk about the dilemma of the Constitutional Court. When marginalized social groups like sexual minorities are pushed to the extreme, they run to courts of law for redress, seeking equality and justice. Indeed, the Constitution guarantees fundamental rights and freedoms to all citizens. The role of the Constitutional Court is primarily to preserve the constitutional postulates by ensuring that the various laws in the country mirror their values. So the main issue for the court to determine was whether the provisions of AHA 2 passed the constitutionality test. Now, in trying to resolve this question, the court faced a huge dilemma in that fulfilling its mission threatened the social order of the capitalist patriarchal state. It had to walk the tightrope between law, power, and politics. The AHA was entangled in a social-political web of forces that involved the executive, parliament, religious leaders, and donor sanctions, not to mention several homophobic African countries that were looking to Uganda for direction and its legacy of rhetorical resistance to international condemnation. So the court was keenly aware of its political influence and had to marshal all available resources to deliver a judgment which at least gives the sense that justice is seen to be done. In that sense, the court considered that 3 of the provisions regarding A, the stigmatization of HIV-positive homosexuals, B, infringing on their right to housing, and C, imposing a duty to report suspected homosexuals to the police were unconstitutional. Needless to say, the main thrust of the judgment was to uphold the law, and in the pages that follow, I set out to demonstrate exactly why. The AHA judgment erased any lingering doubts about the protective nature of the liberally conceived human rights that decorate the Bill of Rights in our constitutions. Returning to the foundational role of the traditional family as a basis for capitalist accumulation and exploitation, and as one of the colonial political structures whose existence is contingent upon the survival of the neo-colonial state, the Constitutional Court had to navigate the tortuous waters of justice while avoiding the pitfalls of blatantly reinforcing discrimination. Hence, the decision of the court clearly demonstrates how the enforcement and implementation of rights can be zealously reinterpreted, manipulated, and twisted to deny basic humanity to the marginalized. In that sense, the Bill of Rights at best only works for those with power to demand equality within an oppressive hierarchical system. At worst, it is a paper tiger for the oppressed. Article 24 of the Ugandan Constitution guarantees the respect for human dignity and protection from inhuman treatment, and classifies this right as non-derogable, meaning that its protection is absolute and cannot be reduced or deviated from. Indeed, the Constitutional Court started off by reminding itself of the decision of its superior, that is the Supreme Court, in the case of Attorney General v. Salvatore Abuki, which cemented the absolute nature of the right to dignity within Uganda's legal system. At the heart of the court's predicament was how to avoid killing the populist law without appearing to contradict constitutional provisions. The court agreed that, and I quote, "the respect for human dignity is the linchpin upon which all human rights gravitate," unquote. However, it went on to contradict itself by holding that Ahatu did not violate the dignity of Ugandans whose sexual orientation does not conform to heteronormative expectations. Most curious was the court's reasoning for denying the right to dignity to this class of Ugandan citizens. The rejection was couched in the now familiar discourse of nationalism. Indeed, the court spilled a lot of ink, 51 paragraphs, explaining why it is duty-bound to override the individual right to dignity in favor of, and I quote, "aspirations, values, and norms of the Ugandan society," end quotes. The court asserted that such aspirations, values, and norms were expressed in the culture and religions of Ugandans. To shore up the legitimacy of its reasoning, it referenced the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which has stated that cultural rights are essential for the maintenance of human dignity and positive social interaction. The court then went on to interpret the committee's words as meaning that, and I quote, "cultural rights are the bedrock of human dignity and positive social interaction, so that human dignity essentially emanates or is derived from a community's way of life, traditions, customs, and even religion, and not necessarily vice versa," unquote. Further on in the judgment, the court reduced the complex pluralistic cultures and religions in Uganda to a simplistic heterosexual Abrahamic culture that supposedly unifies the nation, thereby promoting sexual nationalism. This suggests that any individual who falls outside these institutionalized twin lines of Uganda's culture is not worthy of human dignity. It held, and I quote, "when the right to individual autonomy conflicts with the communal right to social-cultural self-determination, the abstract idea of innate human dignity can no longer be applied on its own, but rather the social, historical, and cultural factors that shape a nation will inform the weight to be attached to the competing dignities," end quote. Now, the enactment of Ahatu in itself was clear evidence of the existence of non-conforming gender and sexual identities in Uganda. Therefore, what is at stake here is a minority sexual culture being pitted against a hegemonic majoritarian one. The judiciary possesses the ideological power for knowledge production, and as part of the state machinery, it protects the status quo in which the values of the ruling class are legitimized and institutionalized. We also note that the power of the dominant group translates into the natural culture of the entire society. Now, to overcome its quandary, the court was careful to reach reasoned decisions, and its 200-page judgment reads like a treatise, although it relied heavily on selected academic authorities. But it was the 2016 article authored by the South African academic Rini Steinman that offered court with a fig leaf by outlining the three basic elements of dignity which the court reproduced in its judgment. First is the inherent dignity paradigm, which posits human dignity as empowerment. Second is the relational claim, which emphasizes that individual dignity is subject to community expectations, that dignity as constraint. And third is the limited state claim, which underscores state duty to provide existential minimum conditions for its citizens. Predictably, the court locked in on the second element, arguing that homosexuality was against Ugandan cultural values. And in dismissing the right to autonomy, the court relied on the 2022 controversial US Supreme Court decision referred to earlier this morning, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned the right to abortion established in Roe v. Wade. By hooking its reasoning to the notion of relational dignity, the court flagrantly departed from the constitutional principle reiterated in the Abuki case that the right to dignity is absolute. It is also quite clear that the court was selective in its analysis of Steinman's work, cherry-picking the statements that supported the argument for sexual nationalism. For example, Steinman argues that in the legal enforcement of the right to dignity, a priori status is given to the inherent dignity paradigm defined in the first element. To illustrate how dignity as empowerment was utilized for the achievement of substantive equality, Steinman refers to several South African Constitutional Court cases, including the oft-quoted death penalty decision in S. v. Makwanyane. Weighing heavily on the court in the Makwanyane case was South Africa's legal history of apartheid and systematic denial of the inherent dignity of Black South Africans. The South African Constitutional Court made it clear that the right to dignity could not be justified by a nation's perception of a particular cultural or religious practice, nor could it be violated in the name of majoritarian politics. Hence, it recognized human dignity as the touchstone for a more humane future, rejecting racial apartheid. In contrast, the selective reading of Steinman's piece led Uganda's Constitutional Court to turn a blind eye to a similar standard for sexual apartheid. More disturbing is the fact that the Constitutional Court remained silent on Steinman's assertion on page 14 of the article that, and I quote, "A person's right to exercise his sexual preferences, that is his right to equality, is often expressed through inherent dignity as empowerment." In other words, element 1 of the concept's definition is often applied in cases of sexual orientation, as was done in the decision of Minister of Home Affairs v. Furi. Indeed, Steinman concluded that courts apply the inherent dignity paradigm in cases of cruel and unusual punishment, as is the case with Ahatu, which criminally punishes convicted homosexuals with a life sentence and even death. As reported by Steinman, the Makwanyane case held that such punishment strips the convicted person of all dignity and treats him or her as an object to be eliminated by the state. This confirms that for the Ahatu, inherent dignity cannot be waived as a non-derogable right. Steinman also discussed the implementation of the relational aspect of dignity, which promotes relational dignity. She specifically provides information on the implementation of relational dignity in the context of giving effect to a person's autonomy to choose their own sexual orientation. She highlights several South African constitutional cases, including National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality v. Minister of Justice, where Justice Ackerman held that, and I quote, "There can be no doubt that the existence of a law which punishes a form of sexual expression for gay men degrades and devalues gay men in our broader society. As such, it is a palpable invasion of their dignity and a breach of Section 10 of the Constitution." That's the one on dignity, end quotes. Meanwhile, Steinman critiques the one South African judgment in a gay rights case, which applied the dignity as constraint criteria. Again, the Constitutional Court in Uganda conveniently ignored these discussions of the second definitional term of dignity in Steinman's article. With all due respect to the justices of the Ugandan Constitutional Court, their application of the dignity principle was based on selective extracts of scholarly texts and constitutional adjudication to justify their prejudicial agenda. That is one of the reasons the petitioners have appealed their decision. Now, analyzing the coloniality of the judgment, it is ironic that those who advocate for the rights of homosexuals in Africa are viewed as promoting imperialist ideologies and agendas, when in reality, legal homophobia was introduced to the continent by colonial administrators in the form of Western codified and religious laws. What is patently alien to the continent are the Abrahamic religions that are key in promoting heteronormativity and homophobia. None of the indigenous communities criminalized homosexuality, and what prevailed were policies akin to don't ask, don't tell. The mother of all ironies is that the ruling class doggedly insist on following colonial beliefs about sexuality that have long been abandoned by the Euro-American legal systems following a long and successful battle by activists there. Today, we see the re-emergence of well-resourced right-wing movements in the global north with an anti-feminist and anti-gender political agenda and a goal of spreading their ideologies to the global south. They mostly work through evangelical churches and organizations like the Family Life Network, FLN. It was the FLN in 2009 that organized a huge conference in Kampala under the theme, Exposing the Homosexual Agenda, featuring several American evangelicals as key speakers that preceded the tabling of AHA 1. The characteristic, selective, and constructive plasticity of the Constitutional Court was also seen in the weight and value given to the different sources of evidence provided by the contesting parties to the case. For example, on whether Ugandan traditional communities tolerated homosexuality, the court chose to take the unresearched evidence of the leader of FLN, who alleged that his people, the Jopadola, historically frowned upon and punished homosexuality. On the other hand, it brushed off cogent proof that homosexuality existed prior to colonialism by a gender and sexuality professor who referenced the ancient Groove cave paintings. It said, without the benefit of viewing the artistic carvings observed by the deponent of the San people in Zimbabwe to draw our own deductions therefrom, we would respectfully refrain from finding that persons who identify as homosexuals were tolerated in traditional African societies, unquote. One would have expected an impartial court to use the same criterion for the unsupported claim about the Jopadola people and make their own deductions after conducting historical research on their culture. Hence, within the context of neoliberal coloniality, the quest for justice from the formal judicial system by sexual minorities was a lost cause from the outset. The systemic structuring of exclusions and processes of containment built into state power is incongruent with the aspirations of the Constitutional Bill of Rights. The paradoxical limits of neoliberal coloniality are written all over the AHA 2, proving that the material practice of sexuality continues to shape and to be shaped by capitalism, patriarchy, and imperialism. In my book, Decolonization and Afrofeminism, I offer a comprehensive analysis of how the Western dual-sex gender system took over African indigenous arrangements and understanding of gender, which were more pluralistic, elastic, and accommodating. I elaborate how historically the organization of gender in many African societies was not necessarily arranged along heterosexual or patriarchal lines, as we have learnt them through colonial conceptualizations. It is those same conceptualizations that the Constitutional Court justices expressed in their judgment, and the parliamentarians before them, only that they read Ugandan culture upside down, misattributing homophobic roots to its traditions. It is a narrative that comes out of skilled manipulation and exploitation of forged history by those who seek to maintain the status quo. To conclude, let me highlight the affinity between dignity and the African indigenous concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are. The indigenous understanding of rights in Africa is rooted not in the individual, but in the communal and in custom. The epistemological understanding of indigenous rights is thus already encompassed in Ubuntu. You do not possess rights as an individual, but rather you hold responsibilities, duties, and obligations towards the collective, including minorities. Given the numerous examples of same-sex conduct present in indigenous African customs, it is unlikely that homosexuality was considered an abomination. The real dilemma lies in African people trying to navigate their lives within the complex terrain of inflexible colonial laws on the one hand, and the more flexible living customary norms embedded in traditional legal system on the other. Indeed, the most egregious legacy of imperialism and colonialism in Africa was not the stealing of our lands and exploitation of our resources, but the stealing of our cultures and the erasure of our histories. African cultures were largely replaced with Abrahamic faiths, and today our historiographical record is selective, distorted, and faked. Colonialism replaced Africa's forward-looking, evolving indigenous laws with a backward-looking legal system that emphasized precedence and judicial notice. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Now we have Sharmila, Parmanand.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here, especially in this panel. I would like to address first my academic location and my politics of location before I talk about my work on trafficking and sex work in the Philippines. So, over a decade ago, I worked in a senior role in an anti-trafficking organization in the Philippines, where I'm from. And then shortly after that, 2 years after that, I left that job and started doing collaborative research with the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, and I maintain that relationship with them. Now it's beyond an academic relationship. I would characterize it as like a research friendship of sorts. But it is difficult, and it's something I grapple with. Now as an academic in a global North institution, I always ask myself, who am I speaking to? Who is my audience? Who am I thinking with and writing for, really, right? And while talking about the Philippines to a foreign audience, there is also the question of the politics of translation and the representational politics involved in making these claims. So I do want to underscore that I am aware of that and I grapple with that and navigate that, and that could be an entirely different talk, right? But given that context, you will find that some of the things I'm going to say now might read like a love letter to former colleagues, as much as it is an address to this room. And so it is gentle, but it is still quite critical, right? So trafficking, which is what I'm going to use as my prism for analyzing sexuality, rights, and labor here. So trafficking is defined in the UN Anti-Trafficking Protocol as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or deception with the aim of exploiting them for profit. The equivalent term in the UK is modern slavery, and Theresa May's new legacy project is the Global Commission on Modern Slavery. There's a lot of money behind it and a lot of like hegemonic power around it. So the Philippines is an important location for theorizing because it occupies a crucial place in legitimizing the global anti-trafficking ecosystem. It is often tagged as a source country for trafficking victims and vulnerable migrants, especially domestic workers. But it is also recognized as a global leader in combating trafficking, having been the first Asia-Pacific country to ratify the UN Anti-Trafficking Protocol and enact domestic legislation to this effect. It was also the first Southeast Asian country to achieve a top-tier ranking in the annual United States in Persons report, which is the widely accepted global scorecard for anti-trafficking efforts by governments. Despite our anti-trafficking work being lauded as a victory for human rights and women's rights, and the Philippines being seen as a model for global South countries, I was haunted by 3 questions. The first question was about how labor and exploitation were defined within the anti-trafficking paradigm. For example, why were the legal and political conversations around domestic work and sex work different from each other? With many Filipinos migrating overseas for work, and at least a fifth of them classified as poor or living under the poverty line, the protection of vulnerable workers, especially women workers, generates significant political attention. Now, anti-trafficking and women's rights organizations have prioritized 2 interventions. First, lobbying for rights recognition and the protection of domestic workers, both those working in the Philippines and overseas. And second, criminalizing sex buyers and third parties, in effect conflating sex work with trafficking. The contrasting approaches constructed domestic work as labor and sex work as exploitation, thereby reifying a hierarchy of work, with domestic work seen as virtuous and sex work as stigmatizing. What does this tell us about the ways in which sexuality shapes our understanding of work, and how our social legal imagination of work also constructs sexuality? The second was how a carceral approach emerged as the dominant paradigm in anti-trafficking in the Philippines. How was it that many feminist organizations, including the one I belong to, with deep political investments in economic redistribution and in challenging imperialism and police violence, have ended up directly or indirectly supporting the United States anti-trafficking focus on policing, prosecution, and border control? What does this tell us about feminist entanglements with the state on questions of sexual violence? In thinking about this question, it needs to be recognized that the state is inherently a violent and masculinist institution, but that there are power asymmetries and colonial dynamics even among states. My third question was based on my collaborative ethnographic research with Filipino sex workers. All of them are either street-based or bar-based sex workers. And there's an entire talk that can be given on methodology here. In the course of this research, it became clear that there was a chasm between official human rights discourse and the lived experiences of the subjects of these rights. So the ways in which agency, care, freedom, family, victimhood, violence, and work were understood and experienced by the sex workers that I engaged with were not legible to and were excluded and distorted by the anti-trafficking framework. Now, when I was younger, I asked the question, could these alternate regimes of personhood and modes of rights making even be conveyed and recognized in the grammar of anti-trafficking and human rights more broadly? Now, I do recognize it to be quite a naive question. But in this short talk, I will discuss preliminary and partial reflections on these questions, which have been developed by thinking with scholars such as Elizabeth Bernstein on carceral feminism, Ratna Kapoor on human rights as a project of containment and on freedom, and Sumi Madok on conceptualizing agency in oppressive situations and attentiveness to vernacular rights cultures. So in terms of my first question, the critique of the distinction between sex and labor is not new. However, the stark difference in the approach of the Philippine anti-trafficking and women's rights groups to sex work and domestic work provides fertile ground for problematizing this distinction. Both sex work and domestic work are heavily feminized sectors and embedded in unequal global political and economic structures. In both cases, there is a strong impulse from the state and justice-oriented groups to protect the women involved because of the power imbalances between the workers and their employers, the perceived weakness of women, and the intimate spaces in which the work is performed. The protective impulse, in the case of domestic work, has created an opening for demanding rights and political recognition, even as domestic workers are also subjected to a range of paternalistic restrictions, ostensibly for their own protection. So the Filipina domestic worker is generally depicted as a bagong bayani, or a modern hero, and a self-sacrificing, dutiful daughter or mother. And in fact, Filipino feminists are quite instrumental in pushing for the International Labour Organization Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers, so in a reversal of, norm setting. Sex workers, on the other hand, are depicted by the Philippine Commission on Women and dominant women's rights groups as passive victims who are incapable of consenting to their own oppression. This could be grounded in an understanding of sex as intimately tied to a woman's personhood and identity in a way that is not true for other forms of intimate labor. It should be noted, and this is where there are resonances with some of what SM was saying, it should be noted that when sex workers I worked with were rescued, they were told that it was for their own good, and they were redirected to other feminized occupations, such as domestic work, factory work, and hairdressing, jobs that are lower paid, labor-intensive, and insecure. Nonetheless, these jobs are coded as more respectable and dignified. It is important to challenge the normative femininity that underpins the distinction between sex work and other forms of feminized work, and to unsettle this distinction. Like sex, domestic work is ordinarily provided as an act of intimacy and usually only overtly commoditized out of economic necessity. Just like sex workers' bodies are read in gendered ways by their clients, workers whose bodies are read as being caring, docile, and deferential, based on racial, age, and gender stereotypes, are preferred by domestic work employers. However, domestic workers inhabit private spaces associated with women and sustain the heterosexual family by supplying low-paid care work to stabilize it, which also effectively sustains formal economy workers and capitalist production. Their work is overtly gendered but desexualized, and in fact, they are officially instructed in mandatory pre-departure trainings to actively play down their sexuality to avoid sexual violence from employers. The sexual lives of Filipino domestic workers overseas are a constant source of anxiety and suspicion for the state, their communities, and their families back home. So much so that when many of them return, they make conscious and deliberate efforts to reassure their partners and social circles of their sexual purity and virtue. On the other hand, sex workers are indeed vulnerable to sexual violence and objectification, but they also transgress sexual norms by visibly resisting the patriarchal bargain of providing sexual intimacy to one man in exchange for his protection. Indeed, they can be read as threatening the stability of families. One of my funniest, fondest conversations with a sex worker activist began with her asking me, "Do you give out blowjobs for free?" She continued, "I used to have a job that involved some violence and providing sex. I got nothing in return. That job was called marriage." So she described sex work as a way of, apologies, fucking my way from no freedom to some freedom. And in the case of this person, sex work was a way of exiting a violent relationship. While the dominant perception of sex workers is that they are bad mothers, the sex workers I have spoken to see their work as a labor of love, as a way of enacting good motherhood and providing for their children. Now, these understandings of love, care, and kinship are incredibly important inversions of existing stigmatizing social scripts on sex work. At the same time, I am very careful to not overemphasize the benevolent motivations of women that women have for work, because I don't want to reproduce as a researcher moral hierarchies of work. Several of the sex workers I spoke to used the Filipino word discarte to describe their work, which roughly translates into resourcefulness, style, and is a term used to describe making do with what one has in difficult economic contexts. So for some, sex work was part of a suite of income-generating strategies as they navigated interconnected and interlocking forms of gendered and economic violence. Overall, it was more flexible and paid better than their realistic alternatives. So it was a way for women to resist their weak position in the labor market. And when one of them thought I was about to rescue them at the beginning of our meeting, she goes, "You are going to hand me a broom and a toilet brush? Will that fix everything?" Another one asked, "Are they afraid that we will, just keep turning to sex work and then there won't be anyone left to exploit in their factories?" Ultimately, on this first question, there is no need to romanticize the emancipatory or transgressive potential of sex work in the same way we do not do this for other forms of precarious work, because agentic actions do not always have to be resistive. Like other forms of feminized work, it requires a mixture of resistance and conformity to gender and capitalistic norms to survive and sometimes thrive. So I argue that sex work and other forms of precarious work are usually interlinked rather than binary. And so this bifurcated approach to sex and work entrenches the exclusion of sex workers from political life and essentially substitutes one form of coercion, sex work, with another, idealized, labor-intensive, low-waged alternatives. And this is done in the guise of protection that extends gender-normative expectations and reinforces rather than challenges the underlying conditions that make violence and exploitation possible and legitimate. Okay, so for purposes of this talk, my second question about difficult entanglements between feminists and institutions I'm really trying to keep the time, on questions of sexual violence, and my third question about the viability of the anti-trafficking framework for creating more open and gender-equal futures are closely related, just for purposes of this discussion. So in more critical terms, I am asking about how much of our radical politics is lost when we adopt anti-trafficking as the main paradigm for addressing exploitation, and whether this framework can be recuperated or salvaged or transformed. So many women's rights groups in the Philippines and around the world saw anti-trafficking as a political opportunity because it was popular, it was the norm, right, to institutionalize anti-sex work legislation. In the context of the Philippines, this was intended to create a sympathetic shift in how sex workers are viewed in public and under the law. So anti-trafficking was a way to override existing laws that criminalize the sale of sex that we inherited from Spain by constructing sex workers as victims in need of rescuing instead, and their clients and third parties as perpetrators instead. Now, while engineering, as I said, love letter, a sympathetic shift in viewing sex workers from criminals to victims may have been well-intentioned, what this means is that the only time sex workers can receive political recognition as rights-bearing subjects is when they identify as victims, bereft of agency, who cannot be held responsible for their immoral activities. This insistence on victimhood divides sex workers into groups of innocent and guilty, and those who do not conform to credible markers of victimhood are denied legal and cultural citizenship. They are still constructed as deviant and criminal bodies, deserving of discipline, which invites further stigmatization and violence, especially from the police, and that is exactly how it has played out. And so this is essentially criminal justice rebranded with a softer face, very similar to SM's discussion of reformation. Even for women who do identify as trafficking victims, the emphasis on victimhood and innocence as a prerequisite for political agency significantly narrows the space within which they are able to access justice, because they have to give an account of themselves in a way that validates their victim status. For example, by acquiescing to being rescued and sheltered and cooperating in the prosecution of their perpetrators. Ultimately, this sympathetic shift is premised on victimhood as a basis for rights and innocence as political currency. In this game, we all lose. Moreover, anti-trafficking, which has as its institutional home the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, inherently defines and addresses sexual exploitation as a criminal justice issue, reducing it to an isolated relationship between innocent victims and harmful perpetrators. As discussed by Sally Engle-Mary in her critique of human rights indicators, the most important metric used by the US Trafficking in Persons report for measuring prevention against sexual exploitation is prosecution and conviction rates. Within this paradigm, there is no space to understand violence within sex work in the context of inequalities in everyday social relations outside sex work. So this selective and incomplete reading of violence obscures the links between sexual violence and economic violence. And by investing in anti-trafficking, we tied our own hands and foreclosed more radical demands for economic redistribution. The emphasis on prosecution is heavily removed from the lived realities of individuals who navigate shifting violence in their lives. In many cases, rescued sex workers have little interest in prosecuting perpetrators, and some even referred to their managers in kinship terms, contrasting the more caring relationships they had formed with their managers to the violence experienced from their biolegal kin. It is true that the sex workers I spoke to did identify as victims. However, close attention to their rendering of the word victims reveals that they saw themselves as victims of poverty, stigma, and policies and practices that removed their bargaining power and exposed them to abuse and extortion. So instead of raids and rehabilitation, they wanted to be seen as decent and honest workers and to not have to constantly worry about meeting their basic needs. Now, these different registers of victimhood matter because they engender different political demands and tell different stories about the relationship between sex workers and the state. In one story, the state is the rescuer, and in another story, it is part of the problem. In the words of one of my interlocutors, the police are our real pimps, the state is our real trafficker. So scholars across many generations have observed that feminist demands for freedom and rights directed at the state have more often been met with moral panic and restrictions on women's sexuality and mobility rather than meaningful sexual freedom. However, the anti-trafficking paradigm is especially amenable to these outcomes because of the centrality of policing, prosecution, and border control to its logic and operation. I should also add that it is bankrolled by the US, which is the world's largest funder on anti-trafficking, and this multi-million-dollar funding is conditional on recipients committing to an anti-prostitution position in their work, which reflects the US government's position that prostitution is just inherently victimizing. So here is the proposal. I propose to divest from the anti-trafficking paradigm and to refuse to help reconstruct the very systems that produce our own vulnerability. Migration is an important example here. Some global south countries, such as the Philippines, police their own citizens' mobility, ostensibly to protect them from exploitation in destination countries. While anti-trafficking officials have genuine, and I recognize this, have genuine effective investments in protecting their own citizens, especially women, from harm and violence by preventing them from traveling overseas if they are deemed at risk, ultimately, these carceralist, classist, and gendered surveillance systems reproduce and stabilize borders. This is doing the dirty work of wealthier countries for them. It either fixes people in their specific locations and forecloses options of pursuing better lives elsewhere, or encourages illicit migration, which increases migrants' precarity, making it easier to extract life and labor from them. At the end of the day, the anti-trafficking regime derives legitimacy from the consent of global South actors who perform the role of willing recipients of protection. It is parasitic on our cooperation. And from this alone, there is space to resist and reimagine alternatives.
Thank you very much, Sharmila, and all the panelists. We have very limited time, so I'm going to take a set of questions. If you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. First there, and then, yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Such a pleasure to having the chance to make a question, especially in front of Dr. Sylvia Tamale, who I really admire because I'm also a lawyer. I also do human rights, and I tried to do the colonial perspective of human rights from my Mexican perspective. So it's really an honor to getting to address this question to the panel. So I think I forgot my name. My name is Fernanda. I'm a student here at the Gender Department in Gender Rights and Human Rights. And I really want to know your insights about how important do you think it's judicial independence, thinking about how rights are being so-called protected in these courts, especially because, like, I think yesterday or the day after, the day before yesterday, the Constitutional Court in the US gave a ruling about that it was constitutional for a state not to renovate the contract of a professor who was in a Catholic church, in a Catholic school, and who was unlawfully kicked out of his work because he was going to get married to his partner. So I want to know the importance, given the fact about, like, for example, like Uganda, the U.S. Constitutional Court, and also the court in El Salvador and other locations in Latin America. How important do you think judicial independence is throughout the protection of rights against this so-called cultural protection of values? So thank you.
Thank you. Professor Angelica.
Sure. Hi, my name is Grecia. I'm in the Masters in Gender Development and Globalization, and I'm really moved by the build idea of reimagining and finding alternatives among all these systems of death. And I specifically want to address my question to SM. Of course, if anybody else has comments on this, I would love to listen to them. But I want to hear more about the methodology of connection, and specifically how does the methodology of connection leads us to transitional justice.
Professor Angelica.
My question is for Sharmila. Maraming salamat. So I'm also Bombay, so I should ask the question. So my question is about the argument you're making about sex work, and we can talk about it in the reception. I found your polemic and very persuasive, But I also wanted to sort of say that the genealogy of sex work, as you know better than I, is mobilized through the history of militarization in the Philippines, right? So Olongapo City, all of that. So I'm saying this also because India has the largest union of sex workers, and unionization has never been a place of possibility in the Philippines in the same way as it has for all of those other histories. So I know you were sort of hurtling through very complicated issues, so maybe over a drink you can tell me more about militarization and sex work, two subjects very dear to me. So thank you.
Let's get one more question in the back, and then we can have our answers.
Thank you so much. Professor Parmanand, thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm in a very similar situation. I worked at a feminist organization for a long time, but I'm also academic myself, like I feel in between. What I was thinking was that, like, also this is about the whole panel, like abolition idea. Do we have to choose, is my question is, I think. Like, do we have to just get rid of the anti-trafficking framework altogether? Because I find myself here, like, being convinced by you a lot, but at the same time, I just have to go back and, like, advocate for a law that would criminalize gender-based violence in Turkey, for instance, right? Like, as a feminist, that's also part of, like, because I work on violence against women, and we provide a lot of support to Philippine women as well, women from Philippines as well, because also they are really, like, the situation, they are in domestic space, and sexual violence and other types of violence that's something that we experience a lot. But I find myself in between this situation. Like, I want to get rid of the state and the law itself, but at the same time, I need the advocacy for like a legal amendment, for instance. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Let's get some answers. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to start. Thank you for both questions, actually. Those were literally the 2 paragraphs I deleted. So on the history of sex work and militarization, bang on correct. And this is why I give a lot of Filipino feminists who oppose sex work a bit more credit than the liberal white feminists who are telling us what to do, because they are coming from a general place of understanding the imperialist and racist imbrications in the context of sex work in the Philippines. So Olongapo is a military base, and the Philippines is former U.S. colony, former debatable. It's very interesting because while structurally this analysis is true that this conditions the possibilities and the economic realities of sex workers, when what is not published in our newspapers, when the bases shut down, the sex workers went on strike, and they were really upset. And they were like, those are our lovers, that is our income, this is our way of life, what do you expect us to do now? And I feel that all of these structural analyses of colonization, imperialism, militarism is very, very important, but it cannot flatten the experiences of sex workers. And if anything, if we had listened more to them, the system by which that could have operated would have been potentially more egalitarian. Now, it is true unionization is not as much of a possibility in the Philippines as it is for India. And that's why I didn't immediately want to prescribe that, because there's a universe in which, if sex work is fully decriminalized, sex workers would be like, we still don't want to be visible. We still don't want to be activists in the traditional sense of voice and visibility. We don't necessarily want to be, we want to operate silently. And I think that's a choice that people can be granted, but I do think there will be a significant improvement in life and well-being. And then they can decide from there where they want to go. In terms of do we have to choose? Also a very good question, because many of these justice-oriented actors that we're having a conversation with work within, and sometimes outside of the state, but these are very porous categories, and it's very hard to say always choose, especially in these contexts, right? What I will say is, kind of similar to what I said about sexual violence being decoupled from other forms of violence, I think we've done the criminalization bit quite extensively already. Let's focus on the more economic empowerment bits, right? Like, and by that I mean, a lot of the vulnerability of migrant workers are because of over-regulation, which already means before they travel, they're heavily in debt already to their recruiters, and the systems that tie them to the visas of their employers, for example, which make it hard for them to go back. So all of these things are things we can dismantle first before running back to criminal justice again, is probably my inclination.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah. Thank you so much for the questions. I appreciate them both. I'll start with the methodology of connection. This is a kind of guideline, a rubric that I developed and kind of remarked upon when I was working through questions that I had around transnational advocacy and what does activism, what could activism look like in disparate locations, particularly thinking about where I'm from, which is Brooklyn, and Kampala, where I was when I was writing this, and particularly looking into the one, so around 2009. And so I break down the methodology of connection into kind of varying levels, but with the fundamental question of what if we center connection rather than disconnection in our studies and in the kind of logic of the questions that we develop in these types of things, particularly questioning around what are the connected histories and aims between myself and the people who are joining me in any kind of research endeavor. What are the connected histories between our legal structures? How are our societies connected? And sometimes that means thinking through the aims, the end goal, and how they impact both parties or all parties involved. I see this as a way to kind of move away from the way that people commonly approach positionality or reflexivity statements as kind of naming why they are outside of or apart from, but rather saying, actually, you are connected to. Whether you are privileged by something that is harming someone, that is a form of connection in and of itself. And so what does it mean to kind of center that connective basis and be honest about the maybe anxieties that it induces around when aims maybe contradict the aims that you imagined having to, when entering the kind of research process. I thought that that was helpful, not so much with transitional justice, but maybe with transformative justice, because it allowed me to really honor storytelling that was happening by people that I was engaging, that I think often could be written off as people who had just such disparate perspectives that they should be dismissed rather than centered. And so this was kind of engaging people who were like, yeah, I think gay people should die. I just think that should happen, right? And so what does it mean to kind of connect with that? And for me, that was kind of digging into personal histories, family histories, et cetera, where I had heard similar narratives just because of the cultural similarities between the Caribbean and the site that I was in. But it also meant seeing it through so that I could figure out, well, what is the underpinning of this, right, statement? And a lot of those were kind of anxieties and fears around imperial harms, around this recruitment question, around children, around, and actually just allowed for us to transform together our sense of what that law was doing vis-a-vis what was happening politically. And so yeah, I'm thinking of maybe a reprint or something. And then in terms of do we have to choose, I think that depends on who the we is in this moment. I have to choose. And I say this as someone impacted by carcerality in ways that are maybe different than others in the space. I feel like I have to choose because I've witnessed how criminalizing even gender-based violence has actually funneled people into further harm and has exacerbated the violence experience within the home because of the counter-deterrent effects of criminalization. So, for example, the culture of silence that is produced when we are told that we have to report something to the police, but that actually throws people into webs of carcerality that will indiscriminately impact us because that form of carceralism was developed specifically to harm racialized people. Or disabled people, or. And so what does it mean to see criminalization as the antidote? I think sometimes means actually noting how perhaps the side of this privilege oppression in relationship to carcerality might just be different between you and the person who is probably most vulnerable to the carceral harms, but also the forms of violence that are running rampant within kind of most marginalized communities. So I'll say yes, we do have to choose, but I also say that framework of the disepistemology is really, really useful with this, because that letting go to attachments of clairvoyance meant, precisely that for the person, the enslaved person, right, is perhaps less curious about what institution replaces than can I get to the other side of this plantation, right? That attachment to what comes next is in and of itself a reflection of privilege. While simultaneously wondering how do I kind of stabilize myself, and how do I produce what I need to produce for sustainability once I reach the other side of the plantation? See, that's a different kind of agenda. Versus perhaps we can put off abolition for now because we don't know what's going to come next, and that scares me because I think plantations actually are running well for my economic security or my kind of fantasy of what our society is built on, you see. So those are the types of responses that I would personally kind of offer that question.
Okay, and very, very briefly, lastly, on the issue of rights, how important are rights? And I think the rights framework, at least as liberally conceptualized, is in intensive care, on all kinds of drips, and about to die. And people have accused us, those of us who say, forget about that regime of rights, that we are throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that's all we have. But if you come from a marginalized group, you don't have to be told. They all know. They all know that when it comes to our rights, these so-called rights, it's totally meaningless. It's a paper tiger. Right. And the case of Aha demonstrates it very, very well. We're in the appeal, the Supreme Court, but we don't have any hope. We're there because hopefully we can then go to the international. But anyway, so the way that the Constitutional Court blatantly sidelined rights in favor of affect culture, Ugandan culture, really demonstrates how meaningless liberalized conceptualization of rights work. So if it works for people that are part of the dominant class, if you are, for example, white, middle class, heterosexual, cisgender, it may work. You go and say and claim for your position within the dominant class. But if you're not, it never works. So if you're if you're a gender studies student or professor or whatever, you know that all intersecting structures, any structures that intersect with gender really mean that human rights as a regime is very flimsy leg to stand on. And so what we need is a revolutionary transformation and forget about rights as we have conceptualized them in a liberalized form, and instead rely on the many indigenous justice systems, gender justice systems, that would be much more meaningful in knowledge production, in conceptualizing ways of knowing, of being, of thinking for marginalized groups, but not the regime of rights as conceptualized in the UN, by the UN, or in our bills of rights. Because, I mean, forget it. And marginalized groups don't have to be told, they know. You know, every day their lands are being taken away and nobody can help them, in spite of what the Constitution says, the bills of rights say. So.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight.